My name is Ethan, and I used to think the scariest thing about New York City was the rent. I was wrong. For 3 years, I worked the graveyard shift as a night inspector for the MTA, checking the structural integrity of the old, abandoned subway tunnels beneath Manhattan. It's a lonely job. Just you, a flashlight, and miles of cold, dripping concrete. You get used to the shadows. You get used to the rats. But you never get used to the silence. On the night of March 14th, I was assigned to Section 4, a deep, forgotten tunnel line closed since the 1970s. The only way in was through a heavy industrial steel door secured by an old digital card reader. To enter, you swipe your ID, the scanner beeps, and a tiny digital screen flashes, "Users inside. 1." I swiped my card. Beep. The screen lit up, but my breath caught in my throat. The pixelated green text read, "Users inside. 2." I stared at it. That was impossible. No one else was scheduled for Section 4. I assumed it was a glitch. The system was decades old, after all. I pushed the heavy door open, stepping into the damp, freezing air of the tunnel. The steel door slammed shut behind me with a loud, metallic echo that seemed to travel for miles. Clang! I switched on my high-powered flashlight, cutting through the thick, heavy darkness. I started walking down the tracks, the gravel crunching beneath my heavy boots. After about 20 minutes of walking, I stopped to log a cracked wall beam. That's when I noticed it. The echo of my footsteps didn't stop when I did. Crunch. One extra, distinct step echoed from the darkness behind me. I spun around, throwing the flashlight beam down the tunnel. Nothing. Just empty tracks disappearing into the black void. "Hello?" I called out. My voice bounced off the curved walls. "Hello? Hello? Hello?" Then, from the absolute darkness just beyond the reach of my light, came a response. It wasn't a word. It was a rhythmic, wet, clicking sound, like a fingernail snapping against steel. Click, click, click. And then a wave of pure, putrid stench hit my face. It smelled of rotting copper and damp, stagnant earth. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I turned and began walking back toward the exit door, fast. My flashlight beam was shaking violently now. I pulled out my company radio, pressing the button. "Control, this is Ethan in Section 4. I think someone else is down here. Code blue." All I got back was a wall of harsh, deafening static. But beneath the static, I could hear that wet clicking sound coming right through the radio speaker. I clipped the radio back to my belt, my chest heaving. To calm my nerves, I pulled up the live security feed of Section 4 on my company phone. The camera was mounted directly above the exit door I was walking toward. I opened the app, waiting for the night vision feed to load. When the screen flickered to life, I stopped dead in my tracks. The camera showed the heavy steel exit door, and standing directly in front of it, looking up into the camera lens, was me. It was my jacket, my build, my flashlight. But it couldn't be me. I was a quarter mile down the tunnel. The thing on the screen slowly raised its arm, waving directly at the camera, with a jerky, disjointed movement, like a puppet with broken strings. I stared at the screen, my mind fracturing with terror. Then, the thing on the video stopped waving. It slowly turned its head around, a full 180 degrees, and looked back down the tunnel, toward the camera, toward me. On the tiny phone screen, I watched myself drop to all fours, its limbs bent backward with loud, sickening cracks. And then it began to sprint down the tracks toward my position, moving with the terrifying spider-like speed of a starved predator. I dropped the phone. It shattered on the gravel. I turned around and sprinted deeper into the abandoned tunnel, my heart exploding in my chest. Behind me, the sound echoed through the dark. The terrifyingly fast, heavy thudding of hands and feet slapping against the wet stones. Thud, 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 thud. It was catching up. I ran until my lungs burned like fire. Up ahead, I saw a rusty maintenance ladder leading to a street-level grated vent. I scrambled up the iron rungs, gasping for air, not daring to look down. I threw my back against the heavy iron grate, screaming for help into the empty New York street above. Miraculously, 2 police officers patrolling the block heard my screams. They pried the grate open and dragged me out into the cold, sweet night air. I collapsed on the concrete, sobbing, pointing at the dark hole below. The police called for backup and searched Section 4 for hours. They found nothing. No intruder, no monster. Just my shattered phone lying on the tracks. They wrote it off as a severe panic attack brought on by isolation. I resigned the next morning. It's been a year since that night. I moved out of New York, bought a small house in the quiet suburbs of Ohio, and took a remote desk job. I thought I had escaped the tunnel. I thought I was safe. But 3 days ago, I had to replace the batteries in my house's smart thermostat. To sync it, I had to log into the main security hub app for my home's digital locks, an app I hadn't opened since I moved in. I connected the device, and the screen refreshed, displaying the status of my house. My blood turned to ice. The digital display read, "Location, main house, active ID cards, 1." But right below it, under the system log, there was a notification from the day I moved in. A green, pixelated line of text that had been sitting there in silence for 12 months. It read, "Users inside, 2." Last night, I woke up at 3:14 a.m. to a sound coming from the dark vacancy of my crawl space beneath the floorboards. It wasn't a footstep. It was a wet, rhythmic clicking sound right beneath my bed. And as I lay there, frozen in pure horror, my phone on the nightstand lit up with a text from my own number. "Thanks for swiping us out. It's so much bigger out here." Hello. I want to share a story that has been bothering me for about 10 years already. To this day, I still can't properly explain what exactly we saw back then. When I was 11 years old, I went to visit my grandmother in a village in western Ukraine. My grandmother had her own garden, flower beds, and she loved flowers very much. It was early spring then, the season of snowdrops, and she asked me to go to the forest and pick some flowers for her. My older sister went with me. She was 19 years old at that time. To get to the forest, we had to walk across a huge field that went steeply uphill. At the top, you could already see the forest. Before the field, we passed several residential houses standing almost separately from the rest of the village, and then an old abandoned military base. After it, the climb to the forest began. The base itself looked creepy. Half-destroyed buildings, concrete, rust, absolute silence all around. We climbed around there a bit, messed around, and then went further into the forest for snowdrops. But there was something else strange. Right in the middle of that slope, there was a hill, almost sticking out from the hillside, and in the center of the hill grew 3 huge oak trees, positioned in an almost perfect triangle. Even back then, that place gave off some unpleasant feeling. We picked a full basket of snowdrops and were already heading back. We were walking down through the field. and I noticed that everywhere on the ground there were little clumps of hay or straw lying around. Like a kid, I started stepping on them just for fun. My sister immediately said, "Don't step on them, or you might wake something up." I didn't really pay attention to it. We walked a little further downhill, and suddenly I got a very strange feeling, like someone was watching us from behind. I don't know why, but I suddenly really wanted to turn around. I turned back toward the hill with the 3 oak trees. And then I saw it. Right between the trees, there was a figure. Floating, not standing. It looked like a woman in a long white dress. Long black hair completely covered her face. At that moment, it reminded me of the girl from The Ring. The creepiest part was that she didn't seem to touch the ground. She was just hanging in the air. At first, I froze and blinked several times, thinking I was imagining it. But the figure didn't disappear. Then, without taking my eyes off it, I suddenly grabbed my sister and told her to look there. I will never forget her face at that moment. Her eyes became huge. Her pupils widened. I couldn't even tell whether it was more shock or animal fear. I was holding her hand, and her hand started shaking. She whispered, "Run." After that, we just took off running downhill across the field like crazy. While running, I turned around one more time to check if it was following us, but there was already nothing there. From the moment we started running, only a few seconds had passed. The figure had simply disappeared. We stopped only about a kilometer later. While running, we lost almost all the flowers. When we told our grandmother what had happened, she replied that during World War II, near those 3 oak trees, allegedly people were tortured and executed. The strangest thing is that years later, I started hearing very similar stories from other people. One of my female friends told me that while staying with her parents at a country house near a forest, she went out onto the balcony at night and saw in the distance the exact same silhouette. A woman with long hair in white clothes who seemed not to walk, but to float through the trees deeper into the forest. I was 12, living in a not-so-good family environment, and rebelling by always wandering off and being alone. This was my way of having peace for just a moment, but never did I think I would regret that. It was August, winter, Australia. My mother and older sister had forced me to go to a big church camp, one that is held on a huge campground that stretches deep into the Australian bush so they could host a few thousand people, where over a week multiple events, workshops and bands, preachers, and just Christians in general would come to participate in one of the many sub-tents they set up. Some were for youth, some were for adults. Tents and caravans were set up mostly in the inner area where all the lights, performance tents, and events were happening. But if you were unlucky, you'd get the spots way out near the edge of the grounds, where the bush started to take over again. We, my sister, her friend, and I, were those unlucky fools. We set up camp in an area right next to the deep forestry, with a small caravan parked about 100 meters to our left, another small cluster of tents about another 100+ meters to our right, and complete bush in front of us. It was an isolated, quiet, dark section that required at least 15 minutes to the nearest bathrooms, 20 to the actual events. Now, I honestly didn't mind this. I actually very much liked this, because it meant I could get away from everyone and have my own time. The people in the caravan never moved. In fact, it seemed practically abandoned, and the family to our right were always out. It was peaceful. One night, there was a big event in the main tent that practically everyone wanted to see. So most tents and caravans were empty, with everyone piling around the one event tent. I, of course, felt this was the perfect time to slip away and get away from everyone. So with a quick, "I feel sick," to my sister, I started to make the walk back to our site, blasting My Chemical Romance through my earphones, and decided to stop at the bathroom on the way back. Now, the bathroom was a small brick building with a couple of showers and stalls. The men's were on the other side of the building, completely separate to the women's. It was empty that night, but I wasn't surprised, as I was sure most people were lining up at the main facilities.
I entered, zoned out of what was going on around me. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes, but when I stepped out, my eyes locked onto a tall man wearing a long black coat, resting against the wall just outside the women's bathroom. He wasn't very old, probably around his 20s. I paused for a moment, confused as to why he would be standing there. My first thought was that he was probably waiting for his girlfriend to finish using the bathroom. But then I remembered the bathroom had been empty. In fact, there was no one around at all. It was completely silent. I began to walk past him, but couldn't help turning my head to look at him again. I guess curiosity couldn't be helped. And that's when his eyes met mine, and instant dread filled my body. I've never seen eyes like that before. Dark, dead, yet filled with this pure hatred, as if he was imagining the unspeakable. Those eyes burnt their way into my mind, and I quickly snapped my head forward and began to speed walk to our site, wanting to get away from this man. I walked in the dark, pausing every few moments when I heard a heavy thud, then a shoe scuff against dirt, then a twig snap. Every time I would spin around and see nothing but large gum trees around me. I nervously laughed at myself, thinking about how much of a coward I was. When I finally did reach camp, I threw myself into the tent, zipped it up, and crawled under my sleeping bag, abandoning the idea of sitting outside and enjoying the night. It wasn't long until I heard the quiet yet heavy thuds of someone coming closer to our camp. It started off fast, and then stopped, slowed, changing directions, a few heavy feet to the right, then above me, then below me. I held my breath, fighting the urge to flick open my phone and message my sister. But I was worried if it was the same man, and he knew I was there, who knows what could happen. So I stayed silent, and after a long while, the heavy footprints began to retreat towards the left. And then there was silence. After that, I messaged my sister and her friend asking when they would be coming back, and thankfully, they were already on their way. When they returned, I mentioned to my sister about the man I saw and how it freaked me out the way he stared at me, but she waved me off, saying I was immature and dramatic. So I dropped it, and for the next 2 nights, nothing more happened. But then, on the third, the man returned. I saw him, earlier in the night, standing at the same spot, with the same look. This time, he didn't stare at me directly. Rather, he side-eyed me. But this time, there was something else mixed in there too. Almost like I was being observed. Throughout most of that night, I stayed at my sister's side until we went to bed. But of course, around 1 or 2 a.m., I found myself unable to sleep and needing the bathroom again. With the memory of that man fresh in my mind, though, I made the decision to go in the bush rather than trekking towards the bathroom where I had seen him, alone. I walked a few meters into the bush, stomping my feet to scare away any snakes or critters that could bite. But before I could do anything else, a quiet thud to my right. A shrub swayed just a little. I froze, staring into the dark, trying to figure out if there was a kangaroo or something that I had startled. But instead of finding a furry rat-like creature, my eyes traveled towards a gum tree, where a figure stood, halfway behind it, as if trying to hide, while simultaneously peeking. I froze in absolute fear and shock,
And before I could react, it moved out from behind the tree, taking a step closer with a deep, whispered, "Hey, hey." Now, don't ask me why, but my immediate reaction was to respond with a stuttered, "What?" before I turned and ran straight back. Now, you'd think, after that, I'd surely immediately wake my sister up, right? Well, that was probably the smart thing to do, but instead, I was so gripped with fear that I did not want to be standing in the open dark trying to wake my sister. So I threw myself in my tent once again and hid. The rest of that night was silent, but I didn't sleep a wink.
I climbed out of my tent the moment the sun rose and found the caravan that had been parked, almost abandoned, to our left was gone. I told my sister everything when she woke up, but she just scolded me for going into the bush in the middle of the night, and life moved on. I'm 25 now, but I still see those dark, hollow eyes when I try to sleep. I don't think I'll ever forget them. Whoever that man was, I know he had the worst intentions, and I simply got lucky.
She was already in my grandfather's funeral photograph. I just didn't know to look for her until my mother was in the ground. That realization, the specific stomach-dropping moment I understood what I was seeing, came at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, alone at my kitchen table with a cracked photo album and a cup of tea gone cold. And when it came, it didn't arrive like a shock. It arrived like something that had always been true, surfacing slowly from black water. My mother's funeral was that afternoon. St. Anthony's, 60-something mourners, a sky outside the windows the color of old concrete. I had spent 3 days before it in the particular numbness that comes not from an absence of feeling, but from too much of it. Signing papers, choosing flowers, nodding at condolences I heard from a great distance. Grief had made me mechanical. I moved through rooms and performed the correct gestures and told myself I was holding together.
I first noticed the woman during the eulogy. She was in the last pew, pressed against the far wall, an entire empty row between her and the nearest mourner. The way you notice something wrong in a room before you can name what it is. A picture slightly off level, a shadow falling the wrong direction. That's how I noticed her. Something about her simply did not belong. She was pale. Not unwell pale. Pale the way very old photographs are pale, as though color had never quite taken hold of her. Her dress was dark and high-collared, the fabric too heavy for November in a heated church, the cut wrong in a way I kept trying to identify and couldn't. Not vintage, not a style choice, just wrong, like clothing from a time that no longer existed being worn by someone who didn't know it didn't exist anymore. She was not looking at the casket. She was not looking at the priest. She was looking at me. I looked away, looked back 30 seconds later. She hadn't moved, hadn't shifted her weight, hadn't glanced at her program, hadn't done any of the small, unconscious things that living people do in chairs. She was simply there, fixed and still, watching me with an expression I couldn't read from that distance. I watched her for the rest of the service. In 40 minutes, I did not see her blink. Afterward, I asked my Aunt Carol if she knew the woman in the back. Carol looked at me with honest confusion and said she hadn't noticed anyone sitting there. I asked my cousin David next, then my mother's oldest friend Patricia, then the priest as he was collecting his notes from the pulpit. One by one, 7 people who had been in that same room told me there was no woman in the back pew. Not that they didn't recognize her, not that they hadn't spoken to her. They simply had not seen her at all.
I drove home, telling myself what anyone would tell themselves. Exhaustion, grief, the mind finding faces in empty spaces because it needed somewhere to put its fear. I made tea I didn't drink. and sat with the quiet of a house that still smelled like someone who was no longer coming back to it. I don't know what pulled me to the photo albums. Some instinct I couldn't name, operating below the level of reason. I went to the hall closet and took the oldest one, cracked spine, photographs behind plastic sleeves gone cloudy with age, and brought it to the kitchen table. My grandparents' wedding. My mother as a girl on a beach I didn't recognize. Relatives blurred by decades. I turned the pages without knowing what I was looking for, only that I was looking. Then I found the photograph from my grandfather's funeral. 1962. Black and white, slightly overexposed, shot from the front of the church looking back toward the doors. I had seen this photograph my entire life. It sat in this album, in this closet, in this house, and I had looked at it 100 times.
I had never looked at the back row. She was there. Last pew, far wall, the same pale face, the same high-collared dress, the same absolute stillness captured even in a 60-year-old photograph. The fabric of her dress held the same weight on her shoulders. She was not looking at the casket or the mourners or anything visible in the frame. She was looking directly into the camera. Directly, it felt, at me. My hands went cold. I turned the page and found a photograph I had never seen before, tucked behind a sleeve so clouded it had hidden the image from any casual glance. Older than my grandfather's funeral, the clothes on the mourners, the interior of a smaller, darker church put it somewhere in the late 1930s. The image was grainy, slightly overexposed at the edges. I found her in 4 seconds.
Back row, last pew, same face across 30 years, completely unchanged, not younger, not different, simply identical. The same woman at 2 funerals separated by 3 decades, wearing the same expression, occupying the same position in the room. I sat with that for a long time. Then I looked closer at the 1930s photograph. Really looked. The way you look when you already know something is wrong and you're just waiting to find out how wrong. At the edge of the frame, half swallowed by the doorway of the church, stood a child. A boy, 7 or 8 years old. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking toward the back pew. He was pointing at her. I opened my laptop and found my mother's family tree. 15 years of careful research, the project she'd loved most in her final decade. I cross-referenced the 1930s photograph with her records until I found the funeral. Then I found the child. He died 10 months after that photograph was taken. He was 8 years old. I went back to the album. I went through every photograph in it, every image I had looked at 100 times without once examining the background, the edges, the spaces that eyes slide past because nothing important is supposed to be there. I found her in 4 more photographs. Different decades, different churches. Always the last pew, always the far wall, always alone, with empty seats around her as though the living gave her a wide berth without knowing why. And in every single photograph, across nearly 90 years of my family's history, she was never looking at the person being buried. She was looking at someone who was still alive.
I lined up all 6 photographs on the kitchen table and looked at them together. My grandfather's funeral, 1962. She was looking at my grandmother, who died 4 years later. The 1930s funeral. She was looking at the child in the doorway, who was dead within the year. The others, cross-referenced against my mother's records, told the same story every time. The person she watched from the back pew was never the next to die. They were always the one after that. which meant she wasn't watching the ones closest to death. She was watching whoever was next in line. I sat with that understanding for a very long time. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. Outside, the November dark pressed flat against the windows. Then, I picked up the photograph from this afternoon, the one my cousin David had taken before the service, standing at the front of the church, looking back toward the doors.
I had not looked at it carefully when he'd sent it. I looked at it now. Last pew. Far wall. There she was. The same face, the same dress, the same unblinking stillness, caught in a photograph taken 6 hours ago. I moved my eyes to see who she was watching. The photograph was slightly blurred at the edges, the focus pulled toward the casket at the front. But the back of the church was clear enough. The mourners in the nearest pews were clear enough. She wasn't looking at any of them. She was looking at the camera. She was looking at David. My phone was already in my hand. I pulled up his contact, pressed call. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice, easy and familiar, telling me to leave a message. I called again. Voicemail. I texted, "Call me. It's urgent. Please." That was 3 hours ago. I have been calling every 20 minutes since. Each time, 4 rings, then his voice, then silence. I have his address. I have my keys. I am sitting here at this table with both in front of me, and I cannot make myself stand up. Because some part of me already understands that whatever I find when I get there, I will be too late. She was never wrong before.